He's a lucky man, my father. He's had quite a few nice and often interesting cars in his life. But if you were to ask him to name the one car that meant the most to him, I know exactly what it would be. It'd be one of these, the Mark I Ford Capri. Introduced in the late 1960s, this was essentially a European Mustang. Now, to look at it, it does look very much like the archetypal pony car. However, it's in about 3/4 scale. Now, this particular car is a 3000E. I'll be honest, I'm not really very au fait with Capris of any generation. A bit before my time and never been that interested in them. But this is the top of the tree. This is the fanciest, most luxurious spec that you could have at the time. It's powered by a 3-litre Essex engine. You see, the Capri came with a huge number of engines over its very, very long production run. To many people, the most famous will probably be the later 2A and 2AI. Those are 2.8-litre injection, in the I of course, engines which were built in Cologne, hence them often being known as the Cologne engines. This car has an Essex lump, so named for exactly the same reasons. This car is possibly a product of Ford's Dagenham plant. They had another plant in the north of England, and I couldn't tell you which one this exact vehicle came from. I can tell you that it has 122,000 miles on the clock. It's never been welded, which in Capri terms is nothing short of miraculous. It's a 1970 car, it's got a 4-speed manual, and it belongs to my father. But it's now going up for sale, which is one of the reasons that I'm here filming it today. So if this car means so much, why is he selling it? Well, very simple really. All car people have something that attracts them to cars, and generally certain cars have certain things that appeal. For some people, it's sheer speed, raw power, impressive numbers that attract them. You have the whole quarter-mile drag scene in America, where there's an entire culture based around being the quickest guy from one set of lights to the next. Well, in England, we don't have that. And in England, if you grew up in the 1970s, this was the car that you looked up to. I don't really know what to say is its modern equivalent, because you would say something like a Focus, maybe a Focus ST, something like that, but this is a far more stylish and less practical proposition. You have this real classic look with this big long bonnet that goes on for days. In fact, you get in this car and instantly you feel like a hero from a 70s TV cop drama. It's really quite a nice place to be. These vinyl or leatherish seats are actually kind of comfy. And the one thing I'm not having a good time with is the gearbox, but once you know what you're doing with it, it's not too bad. Basically, first is way over there, and the spring's just not centering it to the right place, but I'm getting around that okay with a little bit of practice. Now, the reason for sale. Dad has always been obsessed with these. He's had a number of them. I believe this is his 4th or his 5th. In fact, even when he lived in America, which he did for a little bit of the 80s, he had a Capri. Very unusual car to have in the States. Now, what he had when he was a young man was a 1600 GT XLR with the Ford Crossflow engine in sunset red. Many years ago, my father had a yellow 3000 GT XLR. The GT XLR is sort of the step below the E. So the XLR was a package, or I think 3 packages. Again, if you're a Capri expert, please don't quote me on this. And if you're thinking of buying one, please refer to one of the many buyer's guides out there, or the excellent groups on Facebook full of very knowledgeable people for a bit of advice on it. Those cars had things like the 6-pack gauges, gave you a lot more, you got the vents on the side, all sorts of fun stuff like that. Most Capris have a vinyl roof, which if you've got something like my father's old yellow one, contrast really nicely, and they're really typically 70s. This car, interestingly, never had one of those. This is, as it rolled out the factory, this is the correct colour. It's called aubergine. I quite like it. Anyway, I keep digressing. For my father, the thing about a Capri is pure nostalgia. He basically wants to relive his, not childhood, but his younger days. And to do that, he wants a 1600 GT XLR in sunset red. Now, here's the thing about Capris. I've spoken to people that sold them when they were new, and they rusted on the showroom floors. That's why it's so amazing to find one like this, which has never ever been welded. You had cars which were rusting by the time of their first MOT. Some of them rusted by the time of their first winter. They did not last long. They were very much throwaway cars. Ford made an awful lot of them too, and they were not particularly expensive. That's one reason they were so appealing to so many people. The 1600 in particular being not the entry-level model. They did do a 1300, and they did do one with the V4 Pinto engine. But they were not anywhere near as desirable, and so when you had a car that was a few years old, looked like Swiss cheese underneath, cost a fortune to get on the road, you simply scrapped it. In fact, my father's old Capri didn't make it past about 1986. So he's been on the lookout for the last 10 years for a 1600 GT XLR in sunset red. Now, he wanted to do a fair bit to it because he wants to use it as a classic daily driver in the summer and on nice days like today. So it was very possible, and it was starting to get to the point where what he'd have to do is simply buy any Mark 1 Capri and transform it into what he wanted, because the amount of work that was going to be needed would have been so extensive that nearly didn't matter what you started with as a base, but he wanted to try and do things as correct as he possibly could. Now, a little bit of humour for you, we're just going past a place called the Norton Dog. If you put it into Google, you see there's a war memorial there that's been damaged. It was damaged when a police car mounted it. So for the last few years, Dad's been on the hunt for his ideal Capri. He bought this because he saw it. It was an excellent car in good condition, and it is a very, very nice thing by all accounts. And he held onto it in the hope that one day he could perhaps find someone that wouldn't maybe want to sell their 1600, but would swap theirs with this one. He'd had this on eBay and saying that's what he wanted to do. And one day, last year, he got a phone call from a young man who said, "I've just inherited a car. It belonged to my grandfather, who then gave it to my father, who then gave it to me when he passed away. What is it?" Well, it's a Mark 1 pre-facelift Ford Capri 1600 GT XLR. What colour was it? Sunset red. And so my father could not buy this thing quick enough. It needed a lot of work, and it still needs a fair amount of work. The engine for it arrived yesterday, and it looks absolutely gorgeous. It's been completely reworked. I'm not going to spoil what he's doing with that car too much, because I'm going to feature that when it's done. Suffice it to say, it's going to be a really, really nice car. And now he's finally got his dream Capri, the car he is going to keep forever. It is time for this one to go. So for those who aren't familiar with the Mark 1 Capri, what's it like to drive? Well, it's a car from the 60s, really. Although I think people think of it as a 70s icon, it was designed and initially built at the tail end of the decade of peace, love and flowers. but it's a very masculine thing in here. It's all black and meaty, and everything's just got this real analog retro feel about it. It's actually very, very comfortable. Nice soft seats, big sidewalls on the tyres. It's reasonably pokey. I got no interest in finding what the limits of the handling are. I suspect by modern standards they are relatively low. Some cars my father's owned in the past I've never really gelled with. His Triumph Stag, for one, a car I could never really love. When he had his first Capri, or his first Capri that I remembered, I was fairly young, 10, 11, maybe a little bit older, and I didn't really like it, but it slowly grew on me, and then as I got older, I kind of got it a bit more, and when you suddenly look at it as like a British Mustang kind of thing, you go, oh, yeah, okay, I get that. And when he got this one, I actually said, yeah, I like it. I didn't like it enough to drive it for quite some time, but I did finally get to have a go of it last year. This is only the second time that I've ever driven it, and after a little bit of getting down to speed with it and familiarizing yourself with it, it's perfectly pleasant. I'm bimbling along at 50 miles an hour in modern traffic, and the car is giving me no jip whatsoever. There's a few quirks and oddities. The temperature gauge works a bit odd, you know, it basically says that the car's stone cold all the time until it's hot and then it appears. But we drove this all the way to Silverstone and back last year in very high temperatures, got stuck in some traffic on the way back, and apart from the odd cough and splutter, she did remarkably well. I was very impressed. For a car of this era, it's quite quiet in here really. There is actually a fair amount of room. Visibility is excellent, as is usually the case with all of these old cars, because all of the pillars are paper thin. Just as well, because I wouldn't really want to have an accident with one. That V6 up front, one of the reasons my father prefers the 1600 is it's a lighter engine, and he says that the V6 upsets the car's balance somewhat. This is a really light car. I'm talking Elise levels of lightness, because there's really nothing to it. Certainly no fancy pants, wishy-washy, nanny state safety equipment bogging the thing down, that's for sure. It's all oil and chest hair and manliness. Urgh. But to be fair, it's a pussycat to drive. It's actually being quite pleasant. Is it the sort of car that I'd be begging my father to have a go of every time the sun comes out? No, not really. But is it the sort of car that if I had to drive it somewhere I'd have any real issues? Also, no, not really. It's perfectly nice and pleasant. There's a few things need sorting. If it was my car, I'd certainly make the suspension quite a bit more modern. This is very original in the way that it drives, and it doesn't appreciate some of the ruts in the road. But one of the nice things about it, because it is tiny, some of the roads I've been driving on today, when you get modern traffic, big wide vans, cars, lorries who have no appreciation of what the white line in the middle of the road means, you're thankful for the fact that this is really quite a narrow car. It sounds a bit strange as well. It doesn't really sound like the sort of V6 that I'm used to, because I'm used to more revvy, screaming units, and it definitely doesn't sound like a four-cylinder either. I can't quite place it, but when you start it, especially when the car is cold, it's got a real meaty thrum about it. It feels more like a V-twin than a V6. So the Capri is an interesting car, but then so are most cars I feature on the channel. I really need to go and buy myself a thesaurus and find some better ways of describing cars like this. It's a real time-warped car, and I can see why people in the 70s would look up to something like this. With 130 horsepower on tap, it's never really going to set the world on fire. In fact, it was only about another 20 to 25 horsepower up from the 1.6 four-cylinder. The real difference, of course, is that the V6 has a fair slug more torque lower down, meaning it's a little easier unit to drive at low RPM. I certainly don't mind it. In fact, even the Speedo is relatively easy to use. Just like the one in the Lotus XL I used to have, once you hit 30, it sorts itself out and you've got no trouble at all judging what speed it is that you're doing. For some reason, the Rev Counter is reading double what the car's actually doing. Currently thinks I'm doing 6,000 RPM when I'm definitely not, but that's not really a problem. Like all these old cars, the engine tells you when it wants to change up. It's also geared very, very short, and the clutch is really, really easy to manipulate. So getting off the line after you've had a couple of goes to practice is just very easy. Things like this really are one of the reasons that I do love cars and why older cars sometimes are so much more special. I'm a real fan of history in general. Love it. Really fascinated by it, especially, you know, wars and things like that. But so often history is a thing that happens to other people. It's an intangible thing. It is, by very definition, the past. But when you have a car like this, you have a real connection to it. I am driving a piece of history. And more than that, I'm driving something which is a part of my father's history. It's a part of his youth, and my youth is not going to last that much longer, and I'm struggling to think what sort of car might define my youth when I reach my father's age. What's the car that I'm going to think, you know what, I'd love to have another one of those? I'm really not sure, but I'm glad he knows what's special for him, and I'm really, really glad that he managed to find his unicorn car. No, it's not going to be a 10-second car or anything particularly special like that, but it's gonna be special to him. And at the end of the day, isn't that what being a car guy is really all about? Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If you haven't already, please hit the like button, and I'd really appreciate it if you consider subscribing to it. It makes a really big difference to me. If you want to see more videos on older cars, just tell me. If you've got one you'd like to see on the channel, let me know. But for now, we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.